And it's kind of what you see in Ecclesiastes. God has written eternity on the heart of every human being. No matter what your religious belief system, everyone seems to be convinced we actually do have a purpose and a destiny. I mean, I've debated a lot of atheist physicists and astronomers, and but what I find interesting is how passionate they are that there is no God, that God doesn't exist. And I said, your passion tells me you really do believe in God, you just don't like him. Because if you really were convinced that God didn't exist, you'd be treating the existence of God like you do the Easter Bunny or like the Tooth Fairy.
Mhm.
But your passion tells me you really do believe he exists. And what's interesting when I have those conversations, they all say, look, it's not that I hate God, but I do despise his followers. And then they begin to tell me stories of how they've been abused by people who claim to be Christians. And so, which tells me that often it's not the scientific objections that keep them away from Christianity. It's the fact that they've been mistreated and the fact that there's bitterness in their life. And they have a difficulty saying, if there's a God, that God wouldn't allow me to be hurt like this. And so to me, that's a wake-up call to people who are Christians. It tells us in the Bible, they'll know we are Christians by our love. Well, we're not loving towards people that don't believe like we do. And I think what's worse is seeing Christians not showing love to one another. I mean, I keep telling people, look, you're free to disagree with me, but let's disagree on these issues in charity and with respect and gentleness, because non-Christians are watching us. And if they see us despising and hating one another, they're going to say, I want nothing to do with their faith.
Yeah, it was love among believers that really, as a teenager, I saw it made me attracted to Jesus. It was something different that I wasn't really seeing in other people's friendships. So when I want to go back to this point in the mountain where we're talking to the scientists, and for me it's interesting because scientists are better than the non-scientists at describing phenomena and coming up with equations and ways to describe things in paper. Very good at communicators. So when they're saying to you, I had a spiritual experience, did they actually expand on what that actually meant, or is there a way we can
Well,
convey
that
this?
often opens up a conversation because I said, it's not just this beautiful scene that we're seeing in front of this lake and these mountains. Look at the equations that we use to describe the universe. Look how gorgeous those equations are. I mean, you look at Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism, there's an elegance and a beauty to those equations that defies explanation. And when I point that out to physicists, they said, yeah, you're right. When I first saw those equations, I was just struck by how beautiful and elegant they were. And and the fact that we see beauty everywhere. And it was a British theologian that I met, Thomas Torrance, who told me before he passed away that when he engages physicists, he simply talks to them for 20 minutes about the ubiquitous nature of beauty. I mean, you look at these spiral galaxies, and my colleagues in the scientific literature refer to these spiral galaxies as grand design galaxies. They recognize a grand nature about the spiral features of these galaxies. And you look at our galaxy, and it's the most elegant and beautiful of all the spiral galaxies we observed. And so just bringing up those questions. And if beauty is really an elegance is ubiquitous throughout all of nature, and particularly in the mathematics and the physics, then there must be a being that likewise appreciates beauty and elegance and harmony.
Mhm. I've debated people for years trying to it's for me to basically not believe in a God is like the greatest gamble of all time. I just it's like my camera's not working. Is it back now? Okay. So
there we go. Thank you.
like to not believe is basically this web. It's like being in blackness. Why we're only here for 70 or 80 or 90 years, maybe 100 years if we're very blessed. And people are willing to take a gamble that what we do now doesn't affect all of eternity going forward, based on what many trustworthy people are saying, like yourself. They claim to know God through the scriptures and the Bible. It just seems to me completely that even if there was a millionth of a chance of there being a God in an afterlife, because the stakes are basically infinite. Why do people not at least make an effort to see if God is real? And if he's real, maybe I should change my ways. Maybe I should be open to it. But for me, most of the people I talk to, it's just I love what I'm doing. You're talking rubbish, and that's it. And some of those people, some of them pass on, and there's no second chances.
Well, I often talk to scientists and say, would you agree with me that Blaise Pascal is one of the greatest scientists that ever lived? And they would say, yes, I do agree that is the case. Blaise Pascal, one of the greatest scientists that ever lived. And he was the one that wrote down what he called what's now referred to as Pascal's wager. Namely, okay, if there is no God and I pass, I have the same end as anyone else who doesn't believe in God. We basically cease to exist. But if there is a God and we pass away, then we're going to be meeting a judge, and we're going to be evaluated by that judge. And there are consequences. As you point out, there's enormous consequences if there is a God. If there is no God, the consequences are the same for everybody. But if there is a God, there's going to be a difference. And so Pascal was the one that said, given the nature of what's going to happen if there is a God, you'd be wise to prepare for that. And, what I often share with my students as a professor, if you only got one chance to pass the test, you're going to be serious. You're going to study for that. But for example, when I was at the University of Toronto, they said, you need to have a reading knowledge of German, but you can take this multiple choice test on German as many times as you want. We don't care how many times you take the test. Well, did any of us study? No, we just kept taking the test over and over again. And statistically, it reached a point where you're going to pass. By the way, I actually learned some German in the process just by taking the test over and over again. But if I knew I had only one chance to take the test, I would have studied. I would have studied very seriously. And given that we have only one chance to demonstrate our worth and virtue here on earth, we need to take this life very seriously. There's not going to be a second chance. And I think that's a deception I see in Hinduism, where they say, hey, you're going to be reincarnated. Don't worry if things don't work out in this life. You're going to have an infinite number of chances. But when we look at the physics of the universe, we know it's temporal. A heat death is coming. The universe is not eternal. Things are going to end. Matter of fact, it won't be long before our star of the sun is going to be too hot for any kind of life to exist here on Earth. So things are temporal from the perspective of this universe. But why is it that all of us human beings seem to be persuaded that something's going to happen after we die, that this life here on Earth isn't all of it? Why is it that the most committed atheists are convinced that they have value and purpose and meaning? I mean, if there is no God, and if these 70 or 80 years is all there is, then our meaning and purpose is no greater than it is for a speck of dust in the universe. So why are we so focused on purpose and meaning and destiny if we're no better off than a speck of dust orbiting our moon?
It's an interesting question. I've had quite a lot of similar debates. But some people might say, why does there need to be a God to have meaning?
Well, if there is no God and our lives are temporal, then, as it says in the book of Isaiah, if there is no God, you might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. And so, again, from that worldview perspective, the only value in life is temporal pleasure. But very few people live their lives that way. I mean, I know very committed atheist scientists. They don't really engage in much pleasure. They're all focused on putting out these research papers. And, they work around the clock doing their research. But hey, if there is no God, if there is no afterlife, then all of your research is totally meaningless. But they don't believe that. They really believe there's meaning and purpose to what they do. They believe there's actually some value in the relationships they have with their family. But if there is no God and this life is all there is, all of that is utterly meaningless. There's no reason to be moral. You might as well cheat and take advantage of your fellow man because, there is no ultimate morality or truth or value.
Yeah. Because if you sort of boil it down to like the two camps, so one camp is you pretty much determinism. Everything is basically the result of the laws of physics and chemistry and matter. And no matter what you live like in your life, eventually it's just matter. Nothing's changed. It's just conservation of matter and energy. But if you have a worldview like we have, we believe that God actually writes down in a book that all the days of your life before you've lived them. So in a sense, everything you've done will be remembered for all time. So that in a sense is meaning.
Well, it's not only the case that God has written eternity on the heart of every one of us, he's also written a moral law upon our heart. I find no matter where you go in the world, no matter what culture you engage in, they agree on a basic morality that we shouldn't kill one another. We shouldn't commit adultery. We shouldn't steal from one another. Where does all this morality come from? I don't see that in the animals. The animals aren't concerned about morality, but we humans are. We're concerned about justice. And so where does that come from? And why is it that every human being seems to have the same law? If there's no lawgiver, why this ubiquitous law?
Yeah, I think the conscience is something that evolutionists would try to explain as a way to improve the species. But if that's the case, then why bother punishing it? Why bother punishing anything? Because everything is just. Then you could say, well, prisons are part of evolution as well to protect the species. So it's like evolution can explain everything, but I don't think it can really do a fair job.
Evolution can't explain it. I mean, again, I can go back to Blaise Pascal. One of his writings was one of the unique features of human beings is that we're despicable beyond description. Right. And we're virtuous beyond description. It says, how do you explain altruism where a human being will sacrifice his or her life for another human being that they have absolutely no relationship to, and where there's no possibility for the human ever benefiting any of their relatives or friends? Or how do you explain the actions of an Adolf Hitler or a Joe Stalin that would do harm to other people where it actually came back and harmed themselves? I mean, you look at Joe Stalin killing off 20 million Russian intellectuals and his best generals. I mean, that really came back to hurt him. And even during World War II, he was killing off people that really could have really given him some help. And likewise with Adolf Hitler. There was something in that man where he had so much hate within him, he would express that hate, that spite, even though it did him personal harm. And so can you explain that from a Darwinian perspective? I mean, if it's survival of the fittest, there would be no spite in the world, but there'll also be no altruism. And so the fact that we are, virtuous beyond natural possibility, at the same time, there are people amongst us who are spiteful beyond any naturalistic explanation.
Yeah, I think people that have tendency to self-harm, whether it's, food addiction or just chronic gaming. In a sense, that doesn't really fit this idea like we have evolved to do what is best for the species, because I know a lot of people that are basically doing a lot of self-harm basically based on their appetites. And I'm not saying it's easy, because we have so much addictions and temptations around us that we've never had before. So I mean, you just can't, like you said, you can't explain everything with evolution, and Hitler, great example, Stalin, great example, and a whole bunch of other despots. And
Well, I remember debating an atheist paleontologist, and afterwards I said, I don't think you really are an atheist, because from what I understand in our debate, you never really thought about death or what's going to happen after you die. You've never really thought about the issue of whether there's a God out there. It seems to me you're totally absorbed by your scientific research. And he said, yes, you're right. And this is a private conversation, it wasn't public. He says, I think I'm addicted to my science. I get such a thrill out of making these scientific discoveries and publishing these results. It's all consuming. It's all I think about. I said, have you ever thought about the fact that your scientific research is like an addicting video game? And he said, I think you're right. It's actually more addicting than these video games that people are obsessed with. And so then I introduced the idea, the principle of the Sabbath, how God has given us a time, 1 day out of 7 days, in which we're to focus on the most important issues of life. It says, it seems to me your scientific research is distracting you from thinking about the most important issues of life. I said, perhaps you're not an atheist, you're a default atheist. You never really thought about these issues. And he agreed with me that that was correct.